You're useless. That was so stupid. What's wrong with you? This will never work.
They'll say
You'll
no.
embarrass yourself.
You're pathetic.
That was so ridiculous.
How do you manage to look at yourself in the mirror?
You look awful.
You're getting fat. Oh, you're such an idiot.
We talk to ourselves nonstop. We ruminate, we catastrophize, we ask ourselves questions, we complain about things, we criticize ourselves, and most of the communication that we have with ourselves is not something that we realize that we can control. In this particular episode of the Changing Minds podcast, I want to share with you the most important strategies that you can use to change the way you talk to yourself. But I want to do so by unpacking how the inner voice works. I want to walk you through the importance of the inner voice, why it works, how it works, and then explain to you the most important things that you can actually do, the techniques you can use that can transform the relationship that you have with yourself. I'm Owen Fitzpatrick. This is season 5 of the Changing Minds podcast. You're in the right place. Stay wherever you are. And if you're traveling and listen to this in audio, obviously pay attention to where you're going, because you have your inner voice, you're listening to me, you also need to listen to the traffic. So, enjoy. So first of all, let's start our discussion today by talking about the importance of the inner voice. Why do we have one? And what's so important about it? What does the inner voice do? Sometimes people refer to the other voice that we hear as the inner critic. The reality is that we don't just have an inner critic. We have a multi-log of different voices. We sometimes have an inner terrorist that terrifies us by getting us to think about all the worst possible things that might happen, a catastrophizer that gets us to imagine things going wrong. We also have an inner complainer, whereas it might not criticize ourselves, but it might complain about our situation. All of these different voices are voices that are triggered by the way in which we feel. And the reason why we have these voices is largely because our brain is trying to figure out what's going on. And so when we talk about the importance of the inner voice, we have to realize that you are the producer and the consumer of your own self-talk. And in order for you to be able to take control, you need to start to become more of a producer and less of a consumer. Now, you're always going to be consuming everything that you hear. But the truth of the matter is that just like whatever media channels you watch is going to influence you, whatever social media influencers that you pay attention to, that's going to influence the way in which you think and feel. So too, we have what I call your inner propaganda. The thoughts that you think are going to influence you as well. The way you speak to yourself is one of the key ways in which you'll influence yourself. So in order for us to be able to be better at talking to ourselves, we first need to realize that it's not just about talking to ourselves. It's about speaking to ourselves. You see, when you learn to speak to yourself as opposed to talk to yourself, invariably it means that you put yourself in a position where you can effectively influence yourself on purpose, as opposed to allowing the talk to go in whatever direction it goes in. So first of all, when we look at why it's so important for us to be able to speak to ourselves successfully, there's a number of functions that your inner voice plays. The first is self-regulation or self-awareness as well. So first of all, your internal voice allows you to be aware of what's going on. It talks to you and tries to explain what's happening in the world. It also tries to regulate what's going on in your body. It tries to some degree, calm you down, and sometimes it winds you up. But it's trying to figure out what does it need to do in order to keep you safe. You see, our brains are prediction machines, and their job is to predict what's going to happen next. And so the inner voice kind of works like this in such a way that what it's trying to do is help you to figure out what's actually going to happen next in this situation, and what do I need to do? And also, what do I need to feel in order for me to deal with this effectively? Like back in the hunter-gatherer days, we're chased by lions. When you see the lion, your inner voice is the voice that tells you, get out of there. And if you don't have that inner voice, soon you'll have the inner voice that says, oh, look, it looks friendly, until it eats your face. And while it's eating your face, the inner voice will probably be the inner critic saying, you should have left. What kind of a dummy are you? That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Oh, now you're getting your face eaten by a lion. I hope you're happy with yourself. Well done, Owen. Brilliant. And you don't want that, do you? You want your inner voice to be able to empower you. You want it to be able to tell you when you're in danger to get out of danger. You want your inner voice to be smarter than perhaps sometimes you know that you can be. So how do we do that? Well, once again, we have to understand what's going on, the mechanisms by which we speak to ourselves first and foremost. So we're talking about the inner voice and the importance of it. And we have to recognize that as well as regulating ourselves and managing our emotions and helping us be more self-aware, your inner voice also tells you how to think about yourself. It builds what we call your identity. And in fact, it builds a set of beliefs or helps you develop a set of beliefs about the world, about yourself. Because it's constantly sort of like an inner narrator, it's explaining what's going on. So it's a little bit like if you're watching a movie and you're watching certain characters in that movie, but there's a narrator in the background telling you what's going on. That narrator actually has a large control over the narrative that you internalize. So for example, if you're looking at two people staring at each other and they have a sort of a Mona Lisa, you know the Mona Lisa look, it's hard to figure out what's going on in her head. But if they both have a sort of a Mona Lisa look to themselves, and if the inner narrator said they couldn't pull their eyes away from each other, there was some magic there, there was chemistry, but neither of them had the guts to go up. Now, all of a sudden, the narrator's leading you into this love story, and you're going, oh, I hope one of them goes up to the other. I hope this becomes a love story. It's all nice. You manipulate the audience to think that this is a story of two lovers. But you could also have it a little bit different to that. You could have it much darker. You could have these two people staring across at each other. And the narrator could say, she couldn't believe he was here again. Not after what he did. She stared at him, willing him to leave, willing him to die. But he stared right back at her. What was he thinking? Exact same scene, but it's the narrator that dictates the story that you're telling yourself about that situation. Now, if you bring that back to your own internal experience, every experience you have, your inner narrator is describing what's going on in that moment. And as a result of that, your inner voice is building reality. So if you say, well, what's the importance of the inner voice? Obviously, it self-regulates, it builds your self-awareness, but in a nutshell, it builds your reality. It internalizes and interprets everything that's going on and helps to form your belief through the stories it tells you about what's happening in your experience of reality. So when we control the way we speak to ourselves, it transforms our experience of reality. And it's critical for us to learn how to be able to do just that. It allows us to understand the world. And as a result of that, it helps us to cope with or to handle or to deal with some of the challenges that we have. Now, they're the functions of the inner voice. But why do we have an inner voice in the first place? Like, what is some of the psychology tell us about how our inner voices were formed? Well, Vygotsky, a very famous psychologist, spent a lot of time talking about children when they're like toddlers, when they're figuring out the world, where they're just starting to learn to speak. A lot of times they speak to themselves. Now, not only when they're playing do they create a sort of a whole host of characters, but they also will speak to themselves out loud to try to figure things out. And through a process he calls internalization, they start to have those same external voices that they start speaking with. They start to speak to themselves on the inside of their head. And the way in which they speak to themselves will often not just be their voices, but also potentially the voices of their parents, the voices of the caregivers, the voices of their siblings, the voices of their friends, the voices of their teachers. And what happens is that oftentimes the voices that we have inside our head are not just our voices. They're the voices of the people that we're influenced by when we're very young. And so that's why, in many ways, a lot of times people can feel limited, not just by their own inner critic, but that inner critic sounds awfully like someone in their past that was also sort of very critical of them in that context. Now, Sigmund Freud also talked about the notion that we have a sort of a monologue that we use to ourselves, that we talk to ourselves over quite a long stretch. And when we're experiencing the world, that monologue can reveal quite a lot about what's going on. What are the kinds of fears we have? Sometimes we will say things in that monologue that will reveal a lot about how crazy we're. Now, we got to take a little bit of what Freud said tongue in cheek. I mean, Freud was a genius in many respects. The dude was successfully able to identify this notion of conscious and unconscious, which is a metaphor, of course, but it's a wonderful metaphor that really helps us understand the mind really, really well. But he also liked to do a little bit of the, you know what I mean? He was pretty solid into the old cocaine. And he also really liked his mom as well. I'm sure he had a wonderful mother, but you know, he liked her in a different kind of way. At least that's what I would assume from a lot of the work. So when we talk about Freud, we got to respect that he's come up with some great stuff, but not everything he says is perfect. But this just so happens to be a great insight. The great insight is that in order for you to be able to understand what's going on with your inner voice, it's nice to know that these researchers and these experts in this field did start to look at what goes on in terms of the way in which we talk to ourselves. Now, what's also interesting in this monologue that Freud talks about, the fact that we sort of have this inner narrator that we talk to ourselves, actually, some of the research I've read recently in the field of neuroscience suggested that the parts of our brain that light up and are responsive whenever we talk to ourselves from an internal dialogue point of view. So if we're ever arguing with ourselves or criticizing ourselves and it feels like our inner critic is there or whatnot, there's actually some parts of the brain that light up there, the social parts, which also are related to our ability to read other people's minds and understand other people from an empathetic point of view. Whereas when we're in one of those internal monologues that Freud talks about and that we tend to find ourselves falling into the trap of doing, those parts of our brain don't light up. And the takeaway from that research, for me at least, is that when you speak to yourself and you speak to yourself in this monologue, you're operating based upon a different form of communication than whenever you're speaking to the different voices inside your head. So when you're communicating with the other voices in a dialogue or a multilogue, when you're speaking to your inner critic or the different kinds of voices, you're actually engaging in a more social form of communication that happens on the inside of your head. And why this matters is because what I'm suggesting is a lot of the time what we need to do is we need to start to get back to speaking to ourselves as opposed to talking. Because when we talk, oftentimes that implies that we're engaging in dialogue. And while dialogue is useful and fruitful and helpful, and we'll talk about how it's helpful and when it's helpful, it's also something that if you start to speak to yourself more on purpose, you can influence yourself in a more effective way. And so we're going to be exploring exactly how we do just that as we continue. But some of the other reasons why talking to yourself and speaking to yourself is so important is because ultimately, when we try to achieve a particular goal, our brain figures out what do we want to achieve exactly, and our brain tries to figure out what do we need to do to get there. And oftentimes that whole process happens through the way in which we speak to ourselves. And also, whenever we feel a feeling, when we try to understand what that feeling is, our brain once again tries to describe it, tries to talk about it. And in fact, some of the research that was done by Lisa Feldman Barrett, Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett, a phenomenal neuroscientist, looked at a concept known as emotional granularity, which is basically when you're more granular and more specific about your emotions, the more you're able to do that, the more accurately you'll be able to help yourself regulate those emotions. So in other words, you'll have a much better ability to be able to change the way in which you feel whenever you're dealing with those emotions. And so the vocabulary we use, the way we talk to ourselves, the way we speak to ourselves, those words matter, particularly when we talk about our feelings. So for example, instead of saying, I feel bad or I feel terrible, instead you can say, I feel frustrated with this in this situation at this specific time. The more that we start to change the way in which we speak to ourselves, the more that will transform the way in which we experience our reality, as well as, in that case, obviously, our emotion, which is a critical component. But what we need to also understand is what are the kinds of ways in which we talk to ourselves? Like, how does this work? And so in order for us to understand that, we need to start to pause for a second and think about what it really means when we say, speak to yourself. So how does our internal dialogue work? Or how do we speak to ourselves? Well, first of all, what's important to realize is that we have concepts or labels that we give ourselves. So it's not just that you criticize yourself, but whenever you call yourself names, that actually makes a big difference. Just like you categorize your emotions and this whole emotional granularity. Well, the more you label yourself, the more you create more of your identity. Because the labels that you drop in yourself, usually you don't say, oh, I'm feeling lazy today, or I'm acting like a lazy person today. You say, I'm lazy. And you equivocate this notion very, very quickly. And as a result of that, it becomes part of who you are. And you might think to yourself, yeah, but Owen, I know that it's a little bit like some of the languages where they go to be. What do you mean, to be now or to be long term? It's like, by saying I am wrong, do I mean I am wrong right now, or I'm wrong in general as a human being and I know the difference and all that? Look, at the end of the day, if you're constantly labeling yourself, those labels do have an impact upon the way in which you construct the identity that you have for yourself. So the concepts we use, the labels we use, the stories that we use, the way you talk to yourself, the way you communicate to yourself on a constant basis, that is going to be something that becomes habitual for you. And oftentimes, like I said, we don't just have an inner dialogue with our inner critic, right? Inner critic gets a lot of the lads. Like a lot of people like, oh, inner critic, conquer your inner critic, beat your inner critic, destroy your inner critic. Like, first of all, your critic is trying to help you, right? It's like this notion that anyone who's anyway negative needs to be shut up, conquer your inner critic, destroy. And look, I've used that before. I probably have videos on the YouTube channel that says conquer your inner critic, beat your inner critic, destroy your inner critic, pulverize, murder, bury the body of your inner critic until it's forgotten for the rest of it. Chill out on the old inner critic. It's just trying to do its best. It's trying to figure out what's going wrong. And yes, it's not a very good communicator. That's why you have to train it, why you have to speak to it. Because when you speak to your inner critic, not talk to your inner critic, because you say to your inner critic, I'm doing a good job. I'm just trying it out. I think I'll be good at this. Your inner critic's going, no, you won't be. You're useless. You're a piece of crap. You'll never be able to do this. You'll amount to nothing. Your inner critic's job is to point out what's wrong. And you expecting it to turn around and say, oh, you're doing so great. It's just not in its agenda because its goal is to protect you. And it doesn't do it very well because it actually turns the villain into you. But why I'm saying this is because in order for us to be able to do something and to use the techniques that I'll reveal in a little bit, we first need to understand that when you're criticizing yourself, when you're talking to yourself in a negative way, the way in which you do that causes you to start to come up with this notion that it's you battling this evil inner critic. And if that part of you is evil, well, you're always going to be fighting against it. Instead, what you need to do is speak to yourself and recognize that if you've got all of these different voices, if you've got a multi-log of different voices, you've got the inner critic, the inner catastrophizer, the inner terrorist, the inner this, the inner that, then it's about electing a new voice. And we'll talk more about that in a moment, but it's about deciding that you're going to listen to a new voice, a voice that takes control, that takes charge, not a positive thinking voice. You can do it. Oh, where's the book, The Secret? Okay, every day in every way, I'm getting better and better. I'm just going to imagine I'm the law of attraction. I'm attracting what I want. Now, by the way, if you love The Secret, I'm not having a go. I'm kind of having a go. But the point is that just imagining it is not enough. Just being positive is not enough. You have to take action. And one of the actions you take is not just external action, it's internal action. And the internal action is speaking to yourself, learning what are the questions you need to ask? How do you need to change the way in which you communicate with all those other voices? So that those voices don't rule the roost. You don't have to sit there for ages listening to your catastrophizer telling you, this podcast is going to be a nightmare. What are you doing wasting your time? This speech is going to be terrible. They're never going to like you on this date. You're never going to get this job in the interview. We need to learn to be able to have productive conversations and learn to speak, learn to inspire, learn to persuade. You need to get better at persuading yourself. And the way in which you do that is recognizing that the same laws of persuasion that work in the real world work in the internal world as well. And that's exactly what I want to walk you through. Now, before I get into that, let me say, I do know some people have different misconceptions, let's just say, about the inner voice. First of all, some people think it is the devil. Like legitimately, some people think it's actually Satan talking to ourselves. Whenever it says anything like temptation or it says anything like negative, it's like, oh, I need to ban this. This is terrible. I shouldn't be thinking this. But as soon as you say, I shouldn't be doing something, you kind of want to do it more, don't you? I know. It's like, we shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't say yes. I shouldn't eat this cheesecake. I shouldn't eat this banoffee. But you do, don't you? You feel the temptation, you feel the desire because you shouldn't be doing it, but you still do it. And so that's problematic. It's problematic because once again, just because we know we shouldn't be doing something doesn't automatically mean that we're going to avoid the temptation there. So what we need to recognize if we are to change the way we think about it is to understand that this notion that the inner voice is bad is in no way accurate, in no way correct, and in no way useful. This notion that the inner voice also is if you talk to yourself, you're crazy. Look, first of all, nothing wrong with being crazy. If you're crazy, join the club. Being crazy is pretty cool, actually, because it means you think different, you live different. And by the way, if you're not crazy, don't feel left out. Being crazy is nothing too crazy. Did you see what I did there? I used crazy to... The other thing to realize a lot of times that people get wrong is this notion whereby the way we speak to ourselves, you got to listen to your gut, and your gut will always guide you. Let me tell you this right now. Just because listening to your gut can be a good idea doesn't mean that when you think you're listening to your gut, you're always listening to your gut. A lot of times when we think we're listening to our gut, all we're doing is listening to our emotions, our insecurities, our anger, our frustration. And a lot of people live in this land, in the personal development world, sometimes the spiritual world, where they go with what your heart tells you. And this might be a throwback to one of the greatest movies of all time, which is Star Wars. Use the Force, Luke. But Luke Skywalker was trained and also had the midichlorians, or whatever they're called, in his system. Therefore, to a degree, he had the capacity to be able to recognize the Force. Also, he had Obi-Wan Kenobi, legend. And then he had Yoda, legend. So of course, he was able to notice when it was the Force and when it wasn't something else. But the point of it is that you have to know there's a difference between your gut and between what you feel. And you might say, yeah, but that's my gut feeling. But the problem is that oftentimes our feelings masquerade as the gut. And so, for example, you're in an early phase of a relationship and you've all these feelings. And you say to yourself, I really want to love bomb the hell out of this person. I want to tell them how much they mean to me. Oh my goodness, this is going to be amazing. I want to tell them I've never met anyone like them. I want to express my love. And your friend says to you, yeah, but it's the second date, mate. You've only been on one date. And you go, yeah, but I have to speak my truth. Ever hear that? I have to speak my truth. I have to tell them what I really feel. First of all, no, you don't. Second of all, don't. Right? Not a good plan. Not a good strategy. Why? Because that's not your gut. You're saying, well, my gut says that. No, your gut doesn't say that. Your emotions say that. Your desire says that. Your neediness says that. But we have to discern the difference. And as long as we fall into the trap where we constantly assume that every single crazy feeling we have and every ridiculous idea we have comes from this universal source of truth, our inner voice, that's when things become problematic. Right? So we need to understand that this way we speak to ourselves doesn't necessarily mean that we're always speaking truth. You can be just as full of shit as everybody else is out there. And so when we recognize that, it then begs the question, so what do we do? What do we do? Can we actually control the way in which we communicate with ourselves? And I say there's a lot that you can do to control this. And what I'm about to share doesn't just come from NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, although a number of techniques will. It also comes from the field of psychology. It comes from some of the experiments that I've done in working with different people for almost 30 years now, helping them to create changes in their life. So it's a combination of different techniques that I've learned, some from other people and some that I've worked on and developed myself. But these are techniques I've used, really help people to be able to transform the way they, again, not talk, but speak to themselves. So let's look at a few of them. First, we have what I call meta mantras, but this is actually something I learned from Dr. Richard Bandler. Whenever you find yourself talking to yourself and you're like, I'm so useless, I'm this, I'm that, and you know that you're talking shit to yourself, you know you're talking negatively to yourself, repeat the mantra, as Richard would say, repeat the mantra, shut the f up, shut the f up, shut the f up. Now, I like the meta mantras and I came up with a few variations. So the f what? Who the f cares? Why the f no? And when you do that, when you start to use these mantras, what invariably you're doing is what we call a thought stopping technique. It stops you from continuously regaling the same old stupid story that you might have been telling yourself over and over and over and over again. And by doing so, what you're doing is providing yourself with the opportunity to change the way you're speaking to yourself at that moment in time. So the meta mantras are great. You can choose your own. You can use the one that, once again, I shared that Dr. Richard Bandler taught me. But it's a wonderful way of very quickly getting you to stop thinking to yourself the negative thoughts that you're thinking at that moment in time and having that sort of internal dialogue with whichever voices. I'm not going to lay all the blame at the poor old inner critic. The inner critic has had just about enough negative comments. Thank you very much. So I'm going to give it a rest. Maybe it's the inner terrorizer. It's like, oh, everything's going to go wrong and the whole world is the... Shut the f up. Maybe it's the catastrophizer. This is going to be a complete disaster. Shut the f up. It's going to help you. So, and forgive me for the language, but We might bleep over this. Maybe we'll bleep over it. I don't know. If we bleep over it, I'm not sorry for the language. But if we don't bleep over it, apologies. Right? I hope no children are listening. The next is questions. Ask yourself different questions. A lot of times, if you think about having a great dialogue with your other inner voices, a lot of times people try to argue with them. But here's the way it works. The negative voice, whatever type it is, says, you'll never do this. And then you say, yeah, I can do this. I believe in myself. Nobody believes that voice. Nobody believes you when you say, I think I can do this. I believe it. Oh, I read a positive thinking book. Now I'm going to be... No, people are not going to believe you, including your inner voices. So what you want to do is you want to change the dynamics of that conversation instead by asking questions. Whoever asks the questions in a conversation dictates the direction of that conversation. Whoever asks the questions in a conversation dictates the direction of that conversation. So what you can do is ask different questions. What would happen if this worked out? How great am I when I'm at my absolute best? How much fun could I have here? What if everything went the way I wanted to? Who am I at my absolute greatest? When you start changing the questions you ask, you change the direction of your brain, and a lot of times what happens is the dialogue changes because now your inner voices will find themselves responding. Instead of taking control, you're now in control. The next strategy you can use is using a different tone of voice. So I've taught this on a number of videos before, but once again, a lot of the things I've learned from Richard is about changing the tone of the way in which you speak to yourself. So if you find you've got the inner critic, you've got the inner terrorizer, all those different types of negative internal voices, change the tone. So instead of them saying, you're such a useless idiot, Owen, instead you would say, you're such a useless idiot, Owen. And when you make it ridiculous, it changes the way you feel about it. So it's hard for me to take seriously a voice that sounds like that. Therefore, I'm no longer going to fall into the trap going, maybe I am such a useless idiot. Because you're taking the piss out of yourself. Another great technique is using the word but after every negative thing that you say. The word but. I'm trying to pronounce it in an American way because oftentimes when I say but, people go, what word? What word? And they have a trouble understanding me. But, B-U-T. Right. And what you do is you use the word but, say the American pronunciation, use the word but after the negative comment. So you say to yourself, oh, I'm such a loser, but, and as soon as you use that word, what does your brain immediately want to cultivate and create? Something positive. So by using the word but after the negative statement, it trains you to start going in the new direction. And by doing so, you now start to think differently. You train your brain, not this, this, not this, this. And when you keep using but every time you say something negative and then you turn it into something positive, wow. It's amazing. It's phenomenal. It's superb. It's exciting. It's really good stuff. Next is distancing or time language. This is whenever instead of you saying to yourself, I'm such a loser, you try saying, you're such a loser. And then you try and saying, for me, it would be, Owen's such a loser. When you talk about yourself in the third person, it distances you from the pain. So instead of me saying, oh my goodness, I am such a complete loser. Instead, I would say, oh my goodness, Owen Fitzpatrick is such a complete loser. And believe it or not, it doesn't feel nearly as bad. Now, if you said it, it would. It kind of hurt my feelings if I overheard you and you were saying, Owen Fitzpatrick, oh, he's such a loser, he's pathetic, I hate his podcast. Oh, first of all, I'd be saying, why are you still watching the podcast if that's how you feel? But anyway, the point is when you distance yourself from the language, it changes the way in which you feel. And the other thing that it does is that you can also use time language. So instead of saying Owen is such a loser, you say Owen was such a loser. Owen Fitzpatrick was such a loser. Even just changing the time of it actually makes you feel differently about it. It's really, really cool because you no longer find yourself thinking about it now. You're instead thinking about it very differently because it's something that happened in the past and therefore no longer bothers you the next thing. The next technique is a really fun one that I like. I call it speechless, right? And it's because what you want to be able to learn to do is to try to minimize the use of your internal voice. And a lot of people will say, oh, Owen, you're about to tell us about mindfulness or meditation. Absolutely, mindfulness, meditation, transcendental meditation, mindfulness meditation, all of those different types of meditations, they're great. And yes, they are an effective way of you observing your voice and detaching yourself from your inner voice to the point where you minimize the use of it and that helps you to control it. So if you're interested in meditation, absolutely go for it. But when I say speechless, I'm kind of mainly also talking about this notion that when we experience awe, oftentimes that's something that helps us to change the way in which we're communicating with ourselves. When you go somewhere in nature and you just stop and you pay attention to the incredible miracles that exist around us, that experience of awe has a real impact upon your neurology. And the research shows that whenever we experience awe, it has a profound impact upon the way in which we regulate ourselves and our emotions. And as a result, it impacts the way in which we speak to ourselves. So simply putting yourself in places where you experience awe, like wow, can actually render you to a degree speechless, including internally in your mind, a kind of a speechlessness. 2 more strategies. One is surround yourself with the right kind of inputs. So that means surround yourself with the kind of people. Like if you surround yourself with people that are just like constantly whining, it's not going to end well for you. Like if all you do is hear people complain, don't be too surprised if you're like complaining constantly to yourself, because that's what you're hearing all the time. Like I know people that, what do you do during the day? They listen to the news. They listen to all the terrible things that are happening in the news. Then they turn on like soap operas where everyone's cheating on everyone and murdering people and whatnot. Then they do a nice murder mystery before they go to bed at night. How are you supposed to function? How do you think you're going to be positive in your head if everything you're taking on is literally the world is terrible and it's full of scary things and people are dying and it's awful. By the way, everyone cheats on everyone and like people get into all sorts of dramas and the serial killers that might even be living in your town. And then you go to the murder mysteries and it's like, oh yeah, lots of people get away with it. And this person, you wouldn't even thought about it, right? You wouldn't have even known that they were a serial killer, but they chopped up their partner in their sleep. And no one ever figured it out. I think I'll go to sleep now. Of course you're going to be thinking crazy thoughts. Of course you're going to be negative. So instead of that, what you want to be able to do is recognize what kind of things can you expose yourself to? What kind of voices can you hear? So, I was taking the piss out of the secret stuff. But look, if you listen to all this positive stuff over and over again, that's certainly going to be more useful than the murder mysteries. Not having a go at murder mysteries. If you enjoy it, that's fine. But just don't cloud up your entire input of information and what you hear on an everyday basis. Don't cloud it all in terms of that negative, just constant negative information. Finally, the last strategy of all is elect the boss voice. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but David Goggins in a great interview with Dr. Andrew Huberman on the Huberman Lab podcast, which I definitely recommend. One of the things he talks about is he said he created a third character in his head. So it's like he has the David himself, there was the inner critic, let's call it, and he had different names for that. But he said he had a third voice, and this voice wasn't like super positive. It was like not taking any shit. It's like, David, you need to do this. Get up. It's like a drill sergeant type voice. And that voice that he used, this third voice as we call it, is what helped him to change his life. So what is your boss voice? What voice could you start to use where you speak to yourself with this boss voice and you take charge and you take command and you say, this is how it's going to go. Inner critic, I'll listen to you and I'll see if anything you have to say is useful so I can learn from it as feedback. Inner terrorizer, I'll make sure I'm protected. Inner catastrophizer, I'll make sure I've thought through every single eventuality so I'm strategically ready. All the negative inner voices, I'll welcome you. I'll listen to you, but I'm in control. I decide how things go. I decide what direction we're going to go in. And I'm the one who creates the right kind of emotions. Let's do it. When you start to think like this, when you decide to elect the boss voice, what happens is you start to realize that this is your opportunity to transform everything about your life. So, begs the final question. Why should we try to master our inner voice? Well, it's because, let's face it, there's so much that is outside of our control. There's so much in the world that we just can't do anything about. But what you can control is a lot of what goes inside your head. And these techniques are some of the most useful things that you can do that will help you to be able to master your own internal voice. For lots more information, for a lot more videos, as well as podcasts, please do tune in to other episodes of the Changing Minds podcast, or you can see it if you're watching this on YouTube. You'll see a few links to some other episodes that you can check out. For now, I'm Owen Fitzpatrick. I hope you like this new format. But for now, take care, be well, believe better, and may the force, as always, continue to be with you. Bye for now.